We turn now to voluntary euthanasia, which remains illegal and deeply divisive. A Lower Hutt woman, Susan Austin, appeared in court in Wellington last week, charged with importing a controlled drug for use in euthanasia. She was remanded on bail until next month. A huge number of supporters turned out to, support her at court as people attempt to import the drugs themselves, setting aside the arguments around whether or not they should be able to and the larger divisions for and against voluntary euthanasia. There's a risk that the drugs may not be what was ordered, and a sick person may simply make themselves sicker by taking them. Exit International, the voluntary euthanasia advocacy group, have commissioned an app that can check the drugs you received are indeed the drugs you bought. These are checks that can't otherwise be made because under existing laws importing the drugs is illegal. I spoke to Dr. Philip Nitschke, who's in Amsterdam this morning.
Well, of course, it does mean breaking the law. Now, many people, elderly people, make an assessment. They are usually people that have never broken a law in their lives, but they say that this is of such importance to me that I'm now going to go out and break New Zealand law. And it's not just New Zealand law, it's Australian law, and it's the law in the United Kingdom, many countries. And the process itself, though, as I suggested, is really straightforward. People simply go on the internet, send off an email to the right place. Exit publishes those details so that people who wish to can find out what to do. It's very straightforward. But I think the technology is winning. I mean, with new technologies, the internet encryption, bitcoins, that sort of technology, it's getting very hard for the authorities to keep track of people, elderly people who simply want one purchase of this drug. It's not as though they're out there trying to buy drugs of addiction over and over again. They're not on the international drug market for heroin or anything of that nature. They simply want 10 grams of this substance so that they can safely put it away and feel much comfort from knowing it's there.
The bigger picture is, of course, the fact that people have to behave illegally in order to get these drugs. And this, I know, is a discussion that you want to have. And that is the tension between what people are trying to do and what the law allows them to do. How do we better resolve that tension?
I mean, I think we've seen a lot of this going on in many other issues. I mean, change is forced and it will follow. If enough people simply say we have no respect for this law, a law that prevents us from having control over a peaceful and reliable end to our lives, to the point where we're prepared to break these laws. And I must say the penalties for breaking these laws, that is importing this particular drug, are not particularly harsh. We've had about 4 people, about half a dozen now, that have actually found their way in front of a court over the question of importing these drugs. Elderly people, which magistrates by and large have been very sympathetic towards, they've received a fine. In the case of the situations in Australia, no conviction recorded. So they're relatively trivial penalties for what is clearly an illegal act. But in a sense, it's a law which needs changing. And I think as we do see more and more people, a growing cohort of elderly people, the baby boomers are indeed aging at a fair rate, and they're out there saying, look, I want this control and I will take it. And I think that will be the time, and now is the time, for our legislators to really look at this and say, shouldn't we be decriminalising this particular act, that is, of an elderly person acquiring this particular drug for personal use, should be decriminalised. And so we should be altering our law to reflect, I think, changing community standards.
How do you write that law? How do you, for example, you used the word elderly, an elderly person. How do you get the law right? What say you're terminally ill? What say you have some cancer that simply can't be treated and you're 27? How do you incorporate that into the law? How do you get the balancing act between protecting people who, may be suffering from depression and need to be saved from using drugs like this versus people who are terminally ill and really passionately feel they have the right to use them?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, of course. This argument that because there are an example such as you've just pointed to, there are situations where people can find themselves significantly disabled mentally, if you like, to not be in a position to make a clear decision about what's in their best interest. And because these people suffering from some mental condition may inappropriately get these drugs and then, in a sense, misuse them, because that could happen, then, of course, the argument goes, well, no one should have this option. In other words, what I'm saying is that large numbers of elderly people, and I point to elderly people because these are the ones who see benefit in having this drug. It really doesn't have a role other than giving comfort for people who think they might be going to get sick and suffer. They would see a great deal of comfort comes, and what we find is that when people do get access to this drug, they're much happier people. We get elderly groups of people, many, of course, are in New Zealand. We know lots of it. I mean, a great number of New Zealanders have already acquired this drug illegally, and they feel great comfort from knowing it's there. They're happier people. They'll probably live longer simply because they know they've got this issue under control. So you've got to try and balance these things. My concern is that the pendulum has gone too far one way, and people have argued, well, because it might be misused, it might lead to the premature death of a person who shouldn't have used it in that fashion, that no one should have access. And what that does, of course, is leave large numbers of, as I said, elderly people, generally, who are sitting there feeling, look, I want this, I want to know I've got this control, and I shouldn't be denied it simply because there may be some people out there, younger people perhaps, who would foolishly misuse it. So I don't think it's quite the risk that people would build, and I think that it's often used as an argument why things shouldn't change, but things will have to change, I think, to reflect changing community needs, especially as I said, populations age.
You said that you know there are lots of New Zealanders with this drug. We're talking about Nembutal here?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so do you know for a fact that there are lots of New Zealanders who have imported this already, and how do you know that?
Well, we run workshops and we have a good internet communication. We run forums, Exit runs forums where people discuss what they've been able to do. This is through internet communication. People are asking about using encryption. They tell us occasionally when they've been successful. They tell us occasionally when they've been unsuccessful. They also want to know about issues about like testing. So I know, for example, that now this new app is functioning. We've only just got it functioning, but now it is functioning. That there is a demand now in New Zealand for it to be used. So we know of a number of people, I suppose, to be rough estimate would be about 6 to 10 people I know want access to this application right now.
Dr. Philip Nischke talking to us from Amsterdam this morning. We'd love your feedback on what he was saying, and we know it will be polarised and polarising, but do text us 2101 or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz.